welcome everyone to meeting number 21 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. We recognize that we meet on the unprecedented territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and pursuant to Order 1082 and motion adopted by the committee on December 1st, 2025, the committee is continuing its study of issues related to the Indian Act registration. And before I begin, I just wanted to, share condolences with Bob Zimmer, who is a member of the Standing Committee, who is in his community right now. And, I sent him a note yesterday, and he sent one back, and it's just unmanageable, to have that happen. And I know he's doing a stellar job pulling his community together, the children, the teachers, the whole school community, the community writ large, have been affected. So thank you, Bob. Reach out to any of us if we can assist in any manner whatsoever. We're all there for you. And thank you for the first responders there as well. Truly that was an amazing job you did under such circumstances, so Chimingwich. And we also had some other terrible news in Kitagami Zibi Anashnabeg of the Algonquin, and two little ones, 2 souls lost. So again, I heard the chief speak, and you could hear the heart broke. So Chimingwich. Sorry. So without further ado, we have Cindy Woodhouse, National Grand Chief from the Assembly of First Nation, Drew Lafond, Legal Advisor from the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, Grand Chief Kira Wilson by video conference, and we have added Chief Kelly Wolf from Muskeg Lake Cree Nation as well. Thank you very much. As one of the members said, we have a star-studded panel here today, so thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to your testimony. You will have 5 minutes each. Please keep it tight because of the length of it. So please, National Chief.
Chair, as is custom in amongst First Nations people, if we can start with a prayer this morning and maybe even a moment of silence. It's been a rough day for our country yesterday with gun violence, and my heart, the Assembly of First Nations, our hearts go out to Tumbler Ridge, as well as Kitigan Zibi Anishinaabeg Nation. So if Chief Kelly Wolf can maybe guide us on that, Chair.
We lost loved ones. I'd like to start off with the Serenity Prayer. It was a prayer used by a former chief who has passed down now in our Treaty 6 territory, and I utilize it when I can. Creator, grant us the serenity to accept the things that we cannot change. Creator, we ask to provide us the courage to change the things that we can, as well as the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you for your words and putting us on a good way. And just we'll do a moment of silence for 30 seconds or however long you need to take. Thank you.
Miigwech, thank you so very much for that beautiful prayer this morning. Thank you for the acknowledgement to our fellow Canadians, fellow First Nations people having a devastating day. I want to just get into my marks. Thank you so very much for being here this morning. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Cindy Woodhouse-Nepenak, and I'm the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are here in the traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation. Thank you to the committee for the invitation to appear today as you study the Indian registration systems within the Indian Act. The Assembly of First Nations has, number one, reviewed the Indigenous Advisory Process final recommendations and feedback report. Number two, gathered and considered input from First Nations communities. And finally, number three, carefully examined the potential impacts of different approaches to the second generation cutoff rule. During our recent special Chiefs Assembly in December, where our chief gathered here, leadership engaged in considerable dialogue as they adopted AFN Resolution number 54-2025, which has informed my remarks this morning and will inform my remarks this morning. It is widely accepted, and it is the AFN's position that the objective of the Indian Act's second generation cutoff rule is to reduce Canada's obligations by steadily decreasing the number of people entitled to Indian status. It reduces us on paper, even as our people continue to exist. The second generation cutoff rule has serious implications for First Nations identity and membership, and it is discriminatory and increasingly restrictive over generations. The second generation cutoff rule is a blood quantum rule rooted in colonial thinking. Status transmission depends on how much Indian ancestry Canada believes someone has. The rule treats First Nations identity as something that can be diluted and eventually erased. It does not reflect First Nations understandings of belongings and places the power to decide who is Indian enough with the federal government. Over time, this has caused real harm, including teaching families to measure themselves and each other using Canada's rules, creating divisions within communities, and causing people to question their own legitimacy and identity. The second generation cutoff rule raises serious human rights concerns, engages the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and directly affects First Nations jurisdiction over citizenship and belonging. The United Nations Declaration affirms Indigenous peoples' right to determine their own identity and membership, maintain their cultures, institutions, and kinship systems, and be free from forced assimilation. Canada has endorsed the United Nations Declaration and passed legislation committing to its implementation. Yet the second generation cutoff remains and allows Canada, not First Nations, to decide who is recognized as status. I must say, no other group of people in this country is determined like this by Canada. The United Nations Declaration also affirms free, prior, and informed consent, which requires First Nations to be meaningfully involved in decisions that affect their rights, identities, and futures. Changes to the second generation cutoff directly affect identity, citizenship, community membership, and future generations. Free, prior, and informed consent is therefore essential, not optional. Excuse me. The second generation cutoff rule also undermines the right to belong and to pass identity to future generations, rights recognized in international human rights standards, the harshest impact falling, of course, on our women, our descendants as women, and those already made vulnerable by colonial practices and policies. Despite previous amendments to the Indian Act, the second generation cutoff rule continues to perpetuate sex and gender-based discrimination, particularly affecting the descendants of First Nations women. Addressing the second generation cutoff is therefore not only a policy issue, but a human rights obligation must be done in a manner consistent with the United Nations Declaration and free, prior, and informed consent. The impacts of the second generation cutoff rule are considerable, including entrenched gender-based discrimination, disproportionately affecting the descendants of First Nations women, and continue to entrench sex and gender-based discrimination across generations, causing harm to women and their descendants, including loss of culture, identity, and increased vulnerability, creating divisions between status and non-status people, leading to exclusion, reduced access to services, and intergenerational harm. Eroding First Nations identity, sovereignty, and self-determination, while systemically reducing the status population, and has legal and governance consequences, including impacts on funding, land entitlements, and political participation. The path forward, while there is no simple or easy solution to the second generation cutoff rule, any path forward will be complex and must be co-developed with First Nations in line with free, prior, and informed consent. The issues and principles I've shared with this committee today, particularly the ongoing sex and gender-based discrimination embedded in the Indian Act, form the foundation of Resolution number 54, 2025, adopted by the Chiefs in Assembly this past December. Resolution 54, 2025 calls on Canada to meet immediately and without delay end any and all sex and race-based discrimination in the Indian Act to prevent the legislative extinction of status Indians and First Nations, and take steps to recognize and facilitate the exercise of First Nations' inherent jurisdiction over citizenship and membership. We will include a copy of this resolution in our formal submission to the committee for your consideration. So, Chimigwich, thank you so very much.
Chimigwich, Grand Chief, and National Chief, I'm sorry. Next, we have Grand Chief Kyra Wilson of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs by video conference. Welcome.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, National Chief, for your words, and thank you for Chief Wolf for opening us up in a prayer, and for the condolences that we've heard this morning. I just want to say thank you to the chair and thank you to the members of the Standing Committee on the Indigenous and Northern Affairs for the invitation to appear before you today. My name is Kyra Wilson. I'm the Grand Chief for the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. We represent 63 First Nations in Manitoba. And with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, we operate through a mandate from our chiefs in Assembly to advance our treaty rights and inherent rights and self-determination. Today, I'm here to speak in support of Bill S2 and specifically urge the committee in the House of Commons to pass the bill with the Senate amendments intact, including the amendment that repeals the second generation cutoff by restoring the one-parent rule for the Indian Act registration. Under the direction of the AMC Chiefs in Assembly and guided by the Chiefs Committee on Citizenship, AMC continues to advance nation-determined citizenship laws and registries alongside, but not dependent on, the federal registration reforms. The Indian Act registration rules, particularly Section 6.1 and 6.2, the second generation cutoff and the policy of unstated paternity, have caused profound and ongoing harm to First Nations individuals, families, and nations. These registration rules are not abstract policy problems, but they actually have real impacts on our First Nations families every day, including my own. Just to talk about a little bit of my own story, my own child is not eligible under this policy, this legislation. In regards to registration, she's not eligible. So when you look at our journey, you know, I've been a chief for my nation and currently a Grand Chief for the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. And currently my own child is not entitled to be registered as a status Indian under the Indian Act. And so I am in support of Bill S2, but when we look at the Indian Act and currently as it stands, you know, this regime disregards First Nations laws regarding governing citizenship and belonging. It replaces First Nations legal orders with federal administrative rules, and it advances what many have rightly described as legislative extinction by administrative design. Following the Senate's consideration of Bill S2, the AMC Chiefs Committee on Citizenship recommended that AMC continue advancing nation-determined citizenship laws and registries in parallel and not contingent upon federal registration reforms. That direction reflects what was made clear throughout the Senate hearings, that while registration reforms may correct discrete injustices, they cannot resolve the systemic exclusion created by the Indian Act or restore First Nations jurisdiction over citizenship. AMC has consistently viewed the Indian Act amendments such as Bill S2 as transitional measures that may proceed, but they cannot substitute for recognition of First Nations inherent jurisdiction over citizenship. The AMC position has been consistent and very clear that we support the repeal of the second generation cutoff but we do not support the continued reliance on the Indian Act as the framework for defining First Nations citizenship. We have passed multiple resolutions affirming that First Nations have never ceded jurisdiction over citizenship. Indian Act status is a federal administrative category, not citizenship, identity, or nationhood. And reforms to registration must be paired with a transition toward First Nations determined citizenship laws. In closing, Bill S2 represents an important but incomplete step. The Senate has done its job. It's listened to First Nations voices. It responded to the evidence. It removed a discriminatory rule that has caused decades of harm. The House of Commons must do the same, and the Assembly Manitoba Chiefs urges members of Parliament to support Bill S2 with the Senate amendments intact, including the repeal of the second generation cutoff, and to do so without any delays. At the same time, Canada must commit to funded transition toward First Nations control over citizenship, consistent with treaties, inherent rights, and UNDRIP. We know that this work is not new. It is a continuation of long-standing Chiefs and Assembly direction to restore First Nations jurisdiction over our citizens, our laws, and our future generations. Our nations have always known who our people are, and it is time for Canadian law to recognize and respect this. Miigwech. Thank you.
Chief Grand Chief. Next, we have Chief Kelly Wolf from the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation. Go ahead, Chief.
Thank you. I'd just like to share our firsthand experience in engaging our members on our citizenship law. As Muskeg Lake Cree Nation continue to restore our inherent right to self-determination and moving away from under the Indian Act, we've always understood through oral history and teachings that our Creator gave us sovereignty to govern ourselves. Muskeg Lake Cree Nation currently have a seat at the Recognition of Indigenous Rights and Self-Determination table. That was announced in June of 2023 with a letter of intent. This sets the roadmap that will help guide us as treaty partners to implement our inherent right to self-government. Citizenship was and continues to be a primary focus down the self-government path. With approximately 2,500 members and over 85% of our members living outside of the community, and 900 of those members labeled 6-2 under Canada's lens, we knew the consultation sessions were going to be very challenging. We utilized our urban committees in the cities most populated by our members to help with engagement sessions. We had 10 sessions over a 4-month period. We had nearly 500 of our members participate. In addition to that, we've had questionnaires and surveys utilizing our app, utilizing our members portal inside our website. It was very important that we engaged all our people in using every avenue we can. And this ensures every member has a pathway to participate. The engagement themes included our nation's authority over citizenship law, the impacts of the second generation cutoff, recognition of adoption and kinship, and long-term nation sustainability. A clear majority of our members responded and expressed that Muskeg Lake Cree Nation and not Canada should determine who our citizens are. Our members also emphasized aligning citizenship with our values, our tradition, our culture, and our teachings. Responses consistently framed citizenship as an inherent right and not a delegated authority. Our members also emphasized aligning citizenship reform with housing, program capacity, and fiscal planning. Muskeg Lake Cree Nation is not expanding membership indiscriminately. The nation is defining citizenship as a foundation of governance, treaty continuity, and long-term sustainability. Moving forward, we understand when citizens participate, trust grows. And when trust grows, government strengthens. And the answers must not come from leadership alone. They must come from the collective voice of our nation. Because belonging is just not about eligibility. It is about kinship, it is about responsibility, and it is about our future. And ensuring our laws reflect who we are as Muskeg Lake Cree Nation people. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to go to our first round of questioning. Each party will have 6 minutes, and we will start with MP Billy Morin, please.
Thank you, Chair, and just thank you for the acknowledgement of 2 tragedies nationally yesterday, and thank you, Chief, for the opening prayer as well. Thank you to our testimony today from all chiefs. I want to go to Grand Chief Kyra Wilson first. Chief, thank you for your vulnerability and sharing your own personal story with your own children. And you mentioned you support getting rid of the second generation cutoff without delay. We've had every indication that the government intends to delay this, right from the minister to yesterday bureaucrats refusing to give a date on the current consultation process. Can you expand upon how frustrating that is, or what you see the risks are in delaying the second generation cutoff and upholding what the Senate has challenged government to do?
Thank you. Yeah, definitely a frustration there as I hear the words that you shared, that there will be continued delays, and the approach needs to be that this is urgent. We have children and families that are negatively impacted by this every single day, including my own family. As I had mentioned, I do have a child who continually talks about her connection or disconnection to her community. I'm registered with our nation, but my daughter is not. So there is this sense of disconnection. So it's very damaging to our families and to our children that are impacted by this second generation cutoff. And the government needs to take that seriously because there will be further harm to our families if this isn't rectified immediately. And I would imagine that there would be some consequence to that and liability for the government in that regard.
Government can justify being about reconciliation but deny a chief child to be an Indian at the end of the day. That doesn't make any sense to me. Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
National Chief, you spoke at APA committee earlier this year, and the government, you mentioned the government selects the most minimal restrictive legislative steps possible and no more to address the human rights violations being raised. It simply waits for the next piece of successful litigation respecting the discrimination that the Crown knows it has not reached. This is what happened in 1985. This is a repeated pattern of litigation and piecemeal amendments from 1985 to today. Second generation cutoff went beyond Bill C-38. Can you talk about the opportunity to take a different approach to reconciliation instead of just waiting for litigation and court cases, which First Nations seem to always have to do? Talk a little bit about the opportunity here to take a different step and kind of redefine what the next step in reconciliation is like. Do we have to keep going to court, or can we try something new?
Me, so Drew?
Thank you, Chief. Thank you for the invitation here, everyone, members of the committee. My name is Drew Lafond. I'm a member of the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation. I've had the good privilege of having the opportunity to represent as legal counsel both the Assembly of First Nations, but also one of those rare circumstances I've been able to represent my home community, the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation. The Chief spoke very well and very candidly about the challenges we're facing as a community back home with respect to the second generation cutoff rule. To go back to your question there, Chief, former Chief, well, in our culture, once a chief, always a chief. So, Chief Morin, thank you for the question. When we're talking about reconciliation, to peel back some of the layers and all of the rhetoric, in my former capacity as the president of the Indigenous Bar Association, I have been working on the file of Indian status, whether it's discrimination, whether it's the self-determination of Indigenous peoples to determine their own citizens, since at least 2016. We're going on 10 years now since the Desjardins decision was handed down by the courts. And back then, the Standing Senate Committee was considering, with the guidance of the late Maurice Sinclair, this very question about what it means to be a status Indian and what it means to be self-determining. I thought optimistically back then that we were going to have an opportunity to clean up once and for all the discrimination within Section 6 of the Indian Act. We aren't there because of what you had just said, Chief, the incremental approach that was adopted at that time. And I'll remind members of the committee here, if you look back at the records, there was a popular phrase that was circulating back then in 2016, 61A all the way, which essentially would have allowed for any descendant of a status Indian to be eligible to obtain status. It was a one-parent rule, and it was something that was being advocated for by a number of people who made their way before the Senate at that time. Now, of course, here we didn't make it that far. We made it to a formula which was a lot more driven by caution, and I think not as justified and not as in touch with the concerns of Indigenous peoples. And that caution was about money, candidly. The caution was there was a lot of fear-mongering at that time, which wasn't data-driven, about how many more status Indians would be introduced under the Indian Register if we went with a 6-1A all-the-way approach. And I think there were figures ranging between the hundreds of thousands to the millions, without any information or facts or data to support that. But those were the numbers that were being circulated with parliamentarians at that time to evoke some sort of a, I guess you could call it a sentiment that we need to be worried about the budgetary concerns. We need to be worried about the impact on our bottom line that this is going to have. And unfortunately, it was that motivation that drove the Indian Act, Section 6 of the Indian Act that was drafted back in 2017 and ultimately adopted. And we're stuck with that now. Here I am 10 years later, and we're having the same conversation about the same subject matter. And it's because of that reluctance to take that real step with a conversation with Indigenous nations, but specifically the First Nations impacted by Section 6 and what they thought a solution or an interim solution to this problem of discrimination would be.
Thank you very much. So there'll be a time to continue on. We're just a little over the time, so we have to go to the next questioner. Thank you, Chief Miigwech. So for the Liberals, 6 minutes, we have Jaime.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, National Chief and Grand Chief, for joining us today, and the chiefs and legal experts that you've brought forward today. One of the things we brought this study forward, and in my background, I spent 5 years working for the Mi'kmaq to determine a Mi'kmaq beneficiary code, go out to all of the Mi'kmaq communities to try to figure out who was a Mi'kmaq person and who wasn't. And, along the conversation, I think everyone could agree that the second generation cutoff was overly restrictive. Everyone would agree that we needed to get rid of 6-1, 6-2s and turn that over to communities. However, the conversation began to be about what was important about being Mi'kmaq in terms of ancestry, but also there was a fear that if it was too expansive, that there would be strain on resources, that people with very loose connections to the communities would be brought in, and there was very much a sentiment that this should be a community by community approach. So I guess, National Chief, I'll start with you. We have a resolution from the AFN that you said was widely accepted, and I think that it was in terms of getting rid of the second generation cutoff, which I think many can agree with. Did they figure out what we should replace it with? Was it a consistent approval that we should just go with the one-parent rule, or was that mentioned at all in the resolution?
I'm going to have Drew answer that.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Batiste. In conversations with the Assembly at the time, and this was December when the resolution was passed, and it was right around the time that the Senate was considering draft Bill S2 before just after they had received the report from its committee. And the question it resonated with a lot of First Nations, the very one that you had asked. But you won't find any solution, or you won't find any concrete step forward set out in the resolution that was passed by the Chiefs in Assembly back in December.
Wilson, do you think that we should have a solution that comes from the grassroots First Nations communities in terms of how do we replace the 6.1 and 6.2 with something that's created by the First Nations themselves? Do you feel that would be an important process that we undertake, or do you believe just that we should apply the Senate's solution to every single community, whether they like it or not?
Thank you, Jaime. I definitely would say that each community needs to have their input and consultation on this process. We have been talking about this for years. We've talked about solutions. What would that engagement look like? We understand currently our membership. So we have different nations have different membership lists. I believe it's section 10 or 11 that speaks to the different membership lists that communities have. But we also have a process right now, and even when I was chief, if a community member wanted to transfer into our nation, it had to go through a process, which did include approval from Chief and Council. And so there are already processes in place that would allow for this work to happen and to continue. Obviously, with Bill S2, this is a first step. This is not the end. There is a process that we need to undertake as First Nations people to ensure that our laws and our rights are being recognized within legislation.
Thank you for bringing up Section 10 and Section 11, because I brought that up with Indigenous Services Canada at the last one, and I said, why don't we as a federal government just accept when a community goes through the process of creating a membership guideline in their own custom lists, and that's within their jurisdiction to do so under United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, Article 3, why don't we just accept that? Do you think that as a first and guiding step, as an option, should be that if a community accepts community members as part of their section code, that our federal government should recognize them as status?
Absolutely. We have a right as First Nations to provide whatever lists of our membership that we see fit, and the government needs to recognize that and respect that.
National Chief, back to you. One of my concerns is that as much as I respect the processes of Parliament and Senate, I do not feel that any parliamentary committee or Senate committee should be able to bind communities to changes to the Indian Act without their approval. Do you feel that whatever we determine on this in terms of the solution for second generation should be optional for communities, or do you believe that Parliament has the ability to make a one-size-fits-all approach?
30 seconds left.
Look, I think that First Nations need to decide for themselves on who their members are. Canada needs to step out of the way. And many of us come from many different cultural backgrounds in this beautiful country that we all share. Nobody should ever tell you that you're not one background over another. And the same goes for First Nations. We need to decide for ourselves. Chief, I'd like to go to you for
We're just,
last 10 seconds.
We've run out of time. Perhaps we can get that out in a supplement question. So we're going to go to Deputy Gill. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, maybe we can come back to this answer later on, because I think we all have the same vision. I wouldn't accept that someone else, if they attempted to define who I am, if an external authority were to attempt to do that. So we will have to keep coming back to this point. Mr. Lafont talked about, I think, Chair, I will wait a little bit because the witnesses don't seem to be ready to use the interpretation services.
Madame Gill? Oui? Merci. Okay, proceed.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear the interpretation, Chair? Okay, you're getting the interpretation, but it doesn't seem to maybe work for them. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's really... Yes, thank you very much. For the benefit of our witnesses, I just wanted to take a moment. We had some technical difficulties. Thank you very much for being here today, for appearing before the committee. As I was saying, I, for instance, wouldn't accept as an individual, as a citizen, if someone else attempted to define who I am. So I cannot say that I understand it all or everything, but nonetheless, I have empathy for this situation. We have seen some small steps with S2 and other bills. And once again, I think it's Grand Chief Wilson who said that this is a transition. So I have many questions. You referred to consultations. Mr. Lafont has said that it's been 10 years that you've been working on this. I mean, you can also refer to a much longer period, up to 40 years maybe. But are we ready? Are you ready? Are First Nations ready? Has the work been completed in this sense? Not maybe in an idealistic sense of things, because it's highly complex. But are First Nations ready? Can consultations be organized, and can we stop just taking small step after small step? And of course, we have the deadline of April 30th. So can we take meaningful steps and go ahead with the First Nations? And my question is to all of you. Thank you.
Chimingwechekwe, Ogama Khan, he'll speak. Okay, thank you. You guys can get translation for our languages too. Thank you.
Yes, we understand that there is a deadline, and we feel that there needs to be big steps. And it's if you were to put yourselves in our shoes, where an external delegating authority determines where you belong, it's a very awful feeling. And when you hear testimony from families and children and all different ages of our people, knowing that they do belong, that there is lineage, but yet through Canada's lens, they are not a member of our nation. So the longer we wait, the more of our people will be impacted. And it's important that we move forward without hesitation. So I agree that there should be big steps. Thank you.
J'avais deux questions peut-être secondaires.
So I have two follow-up questions. Are we ready to solve once and for all this issue, this problem? There is a deadline. We can opt to go with S2, but are we ready to take it to its logical conclusion, this matter? And are we ready to hold consultations? And can these be organized rapidly? Of course, these can be done simultaneously. So two questions: are we ready for consultations? And are we ready to find solutions to solve this problem once and for all, before waiting for additional court procedures?
Monsieur le Président, est-ce qu'on peut suspendre?
Chair, can we suspend, please?
For Drew, Deputy Gill. Okay.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'aimerais savoir.
Thank you, Chair. Can I know how much time I have left? Are we back in session? Okay, if we're ready to get going again, thank you, Chair. How much time do I have? Because I was interrupted twice. Two of the witnesses were not able to get the interpretation.
30 seconds.
Ouais. Pour répéter 3 fois, je pense que j'avais presque.
Okay, so if I repeat the question again, that will be my time up. But my question to all of our witnesses, again, out of respect for my language, of course, I hope to be able to express myself in the language of my choosing. So if you have additional information, and this to all witnesses, maybe we didn't have the time, or I might not have the time to ask all of my questions, please provide any additional information to the committee so that we can integrate them into our recommendations. So I was saying that I wouldn't want anyone else to decide who I am, and so First Nations should have the same right. Are we ready for consultations which will solve once and for all this issue of membership and registration? And we shouldn't be taking baby steps in this matter and go from one court case to another court case. So are we ready to go ahead with these consultations? Is it even possible, even though we have work that is going on with S2? So I apologize for the technical difficulties, but thank you. And again, if you have additional information, please send everything you have to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I just want to briefly speak to your comment regarding consultation. We have been consulting internally with our communities on this very question of citizenship ever since 1985, at least in my recent memory, in my own memory, about how we overcome the issue of this dichotomy of Indian status versus band membership versus Indigenous citizenship. When you talk about when we're talking about timing and whether this is the right time to make substantive change, like monumental seismic change to the Indian Act regime, I think we're long overdue. But I want to also be mindful of the political realities, and this also reflects upon the question that was asked by Mr. Batiste earlier. It's not going to be easy to disentangle Indian status from Indigenous citizenship. If it were, we would have been able to resolve this question back in 1985. We're in this position because Indian status has been a reality in Indigenous communities and First Nation communities now since at least 1850. So we're looking at over a century and a half of disentangling colonial legislation from our Indigenous citizenship systems. That's going to take, even for our own members who now use Indian status, many of whom use Indian status as a proxy for their own identity. We are going to be, the path to reinvigorating and exercising our own rights over Indigenous citizenship is going to be a significant journey for Indigenous peoples themselves. That's a journey that we'll undertake. But let's not lose sight of the fact that it's the federal government, it's the Crown that has legislated Indigenous identity, and it's the Crown's responsibility to justify any discrimination under that legislation. Again, I don't want to muddy the waters here.
Deputy Gill said, please, if you have more in writing, send it in. That goes for all questions or anything in the study as well. I'm going to acknowledge Lori, who is online. She had her hand up. Lori, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I'm very much hoping to get the unanimous consent of the committee to ask questions to the witnesses on this important issue.
I'm hearing at the end, Lori, I'm hearing at the end, so we're going to go through a round of questions, and then at the end we will allocate some time to ask a question. That's what the committee has said, so I think that's fair. So you'll be recognized at the end and have an opportunity to ask a question. So, Miigwech. Okay, so back to our questions, second round. We have Billy Moore again. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Chief Wolf, you're going through the process of developing your own citizenship and membership law. I inherently believe, as I think is iterated by all parties and consistently from First Nations, the solutions lie in them developing their own laws. But it takes time to get there. You have a nation, just looking at some of the stats, a little bit of a smaller on-reserve population, yes, and some on the urban side a little bit more. Is that correct? Yeah, so it'll be difficult for you to meet the threshold of maybe 50% plus one to get the referendum through under the current rules. Is that correct? Yes. You know, I want you to comment a little bit, though, on some of the inconsistencies from governments applying their own legislation. So speaking for myself, which I can, when I pass my own election law, the same thresholds apply when it comes to creating your own custom election law, which is 50% plus one on referendum. I do thank the current government under that time a number of years ago who said, well, we'll ignore that and you can still have your custom election, because we had a great, decent turnout and did everything above verbatim. Also, they refused to implement First Nations Transparency Act. They also say we want to consult and do free, prior informed consent, but they didn't do it on C5 and other land regulation laws. So what does that say to you when they pick and choose when to do consultation, when not to, when to enforce law, and when not to when it comes to your jurisdiction?
Thank you for that, Chief. The challenge is when in our community, we have, like I shared earlier, 15% of our members live inside the nation. So the double majority rule, it becomes really challenging. Even in our own custom elections with 1,800 eligible voters, we average around 600 voting in our custom elections. So it does become very challenging. The inconsistencies are very detrimental to our people and our future generations and our children. So, yeah, it's very frustrating, Chief, if I could say it bluntly. Thank you.
Yeah, I wish they would just be a little bit more consistent if they're, and I think rightfully so, going to be flexible in developing own laws, as long as it's prudent. I think that's a right thing to take, but shouldn't be picking and choosing when to apply the law and when not to. National Chief, I inherently actually, not quoting verbatim, but I do believe the government has a responsibility to uphold the Charter, Bills of Rights, and everything when it comes to sex discrimination against women and children, against any law, including the Indian Act. And so I think we're seeing consultation as a shield here. There has been consultation. The current process has started in 2023. Mr. Lafond has said they've been consulting internally since 1985. Isn't it frustrating that consultation now is being used as a shield on the government side when the right thing to do is to look at getting urgency when it comes to second generation cutoff?
Well, thank you. Absolutely. Look, I think that we need to move along, and First Nations have the ability to determine their own membership. I know that it's always been a push from Ottawa to tell First Nations who we are. It is very frustrating as a First Nations person, I think, altogether. I mean, we see mothers, fathers having to deal with this time and time again, as well as you think of, children in care, that many times the paperwork doesn't get done, so then these children are left out. Like, there's so many different instances that we can talk about, so many issues. I mean, Grand Chief just advised how her family, her own daughter, is affected. So her grandchildren will never be identified as First Nations by Canada. By us, they will. They always will, right? But we've got a discrimination in this country against First Nations people, and it really needs to stop. So let's work together. Let's move forward in a good way and find a path forward together. So thank you.
Last one is my basic understanding to help combat some of the aspects of consultation and implementation, which I agree are going to be nation by nation. And the process exists go from Section 11 to Section 10 already. I understand the bill is contemplating a one-year implementation role. Back in 1985, they were saying maybe 2 years on the general list. And so there is precedent set in terms of allowing a transition phase, but acting aggressively and not waiting for a court case litigation. Do you believe that there is adequate transition mechanisms in place right now to get rid of the second generation cutoff?
Certainly. I think whether we even, thank you for the question again, Chief. Let's put it this way. We're racing to a red light on this one. I don't want to give the impression that this is going to be the end. The elimination of the second generation cutoff rule is the end of the conversation. But we are racing to an inevitable conclusion, an inevitable question. And it's the elephant in the room that I think everybody's asking, and I think indirectly what Mr. Battiste's question was getting at, which is what happens in the event that an Indigenous nation, a First Nation, has its list of who it believes its citizens are, and what happens when that list is not the same as the federal government's? What do we do with the people who are left in the fray?
So that's an excellent
And
question. We have to go to the next questioner.
That's the question, yeah. Anyways.
Thank you. Okay, and so next for the Liberals, we have Jeanette, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much to all of our witnesses here today and online for your participation. We're happy to welcome you here and to have this dialogue. National Chief, you mentioned the importance of co-development in terms of coming up with what the solutions are. We have before us a bill that has gone before Senate committee where witnesses certainly appeared, but that there was not, more than that, there was not a consultative process that existed. How do we reconcile, how can Parliament really ensure that the reforms to second generation cutoff are grounded in broad consensus? And that is truly co-developed, because we've heard from nations. We know that there's not a one-size-fits-all. We're often criticized for a lack of consultation. And so how do we do this in a way that is appropriate?
Specifically with the question, and I can say even at a community level, there is no consensus on the matter of blood quantum. And I'm saying this again, I'll reiterate, disentangling our cultures from 150 years of colonial legislation has been an uphill battle, to say the least. There's literature, voluminous literature on this issue of we've internalized these systems for the most part, not only at the governance level, but at the individual identity level. Indian status is a proxy for identity. So the opinions, even at the community level, and Chief Wolf can attest to this at our community engagement sessions, are all over the map. What people genuinely do agree with, though, is that the discrimination under the Indian Act, again, which is a separate question from our own exercise of our self-determination, discrimination can't exist within Section 6 of the Indian Act. The Charter prevents it from doing so unless there's some justification for that discrimination. How you satisfy yourselves that there has been some justification for discrimination within the Indian Act, that's entirely up to Parliament. But at the community level, we're building that broad consensus within our community in accordance with what consensus requires or demands within our, according to our legal traditions and our legal customs and protocols. So if Parliament is waiting for Indigenous peoples to reach a consensus on the elimination of blood quantum from Indian status, we're going to be here in another 10 years.
So maybe to continue on that, what risks would you or should we be mindful of in terms of legislative changes and advancing them without really completely, changes? Let me retake my question. What risk should we be mindful of if legislation changes are advanced without completing the current Indigenous-led collaborative process?
And I identified this risk earlier, which is Indigenous people are, like the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, are undertaking the exercise of determining who is and who is not a citizen of their communities now. We're doing that independent of the S2 collaborative process. The inevitable question, again, is what happens when Muskeg produces its list and individuals who are status Indians, who are eligible for status, don't meet our criteria for whatever reason, whatever that happens to be. What happens with respect to those individuals? And the risk is that there will be further discrimination on the federal government side because of what the federal government has done over the last 150 years to legislate in the area in a discriminatory fashion. And again, once we've enacted and once we've implemented our own laws, and once we produced our systems for inclusion and kinship and belonging, if there are people who are not on our list, but who still meet the federal government's formula, then that's a question, that's the big question. That's the real question. We're gonna be faced with that question inevitably. What's delaying that conversation from happening is we're not dealing with the discrimination that we know exists today within the Indian Act, which is the second generation cutoff rule.
Thank you very much. And that's all the time we have. 5 seconds, but that's it. Deputy Gill for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I was finishing up my questions with Mr. Lafond because, yes, since 1995, this has been going on in one sense, but in my riding at Washak Makatanam, for instance, there is a bit of an urgency where you have 900 members who are faced with the risk of their rights being threatened. So it's a bit of an emergency situation. But from a more pragmatic point of view, yes, people can have their own identity, but there's also the question of how we go about implementing all this. It has been quite long. The Auditor General had a report on this, and the number of services available is not always sufficient. And what I'm concerned about is that at this committee we're dealing with a lot of issues such as housing and others, so there's a lot that needs to be rectified in many communities. But there are still a lot of people that need to provide services to support these communities. Is this something you think about at the same time? So that we can do all of this rather quickly. So going back to the first point of urgency, so that we can take care of this quickly and that the resources are available for First Nations as well. Thank you.
I echo your concerns, Vice Chair, with respect to the urgency required to implement the changes to the Indian Act to remove the second generation cutoff rule. I think a solution is long overdue. I think we need to begin work on implementing it immediately. I think the removal is going to create some shock value with respect to, again, that internalization, that proxy status, that Indian status has within our communities. There will be that adjustment, period. Delaying that adjustment, that inevitable adjustment, isn't doing any good. In fact, it's perpetrating more harms on Indigenous communities. It's furthering discrimination within the Indian Act. Your question regarding resources, I'll reiterate from my original comments, the resources or the perceived lack thereof has been used as an excuse to push the buck down further and further ever since I've been on this file since 2016. And again, without a material justification, unless something can, where are the numbers to demonstrate this scarcity? Where are the numbers to demonstrate this overwhelming, this floodgate approach that everybody has been fear-mongering for a decade or more now? Where are the numbers to demonstrate that? And then we can start having budgetary conversations. But the absence of that information, for me, is underwhelming, and I think the urgency overrides that concern at this stage.
Thank you very much. And next we will go to MP Schmel.
No, it was
Nope.
Jaime. Was
Oh,
it?
sorry, okay, sorry.
That Jaime,
Yes, you're right, Jaime, it would be next.
I could ask questions. If you
No,
want.
no, that's okay.
Okay.
We'll get Lori's in here. Okay, go ahead.
Grand Chief, I'm going to start with you, Wilson. In terms of, we've had a lot of good conversations about Section 6.1 and this, but we really haven't touched on the non-stated paternity policy that that discriminates against women by saying that if you don't put the father's name on the birth certificate, then that child is automatically assumed to be non-Indigenous. Now, my contention and my thoughts around this is that if a community determines through a band council resolution that that child is eligible under that community's membership or under any circumstance, that community should have the ability to have that child registered as a status Indian and put that to the federal government. Do you feel like that's a fair process, or how can we fix the non-stated paternity policy?
Well, that's the current issue that we see in community right now, is that women are not or unsure of how to engage with identifying who the father is on the birth certificates. I am well aware of situations where leadership are signing their names on birth certificates, and that's a huge problem that needs to be addressed. How is it that you've got the whole process that we've seen historically with Bill C-31 and the attempt to end gender discrimination, but yet we're still dealing with it today? So obviously there's a lot of work, and even Drew Lafon spoke to that. We've been dealing with this since the 80s, maybe even longer, since day one. Since day one of the Indian Act, discrimination is a huge issue against our First Nations people and our women. So we need to find solutions. We may not have all the solutions today, but we need to start somewhere.
Thank you very much. And now we've had consensus from the committee, Lori, and you'll have 2.5 minutes to have questions and have them answered. Proceed.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I do want to note that MP Marilyn Gill has asked the questions that I would have asked regarding what's been happening and how urgent we need to see us to move forward. And I also wanted to say very quickly in response to National Chief about using your Indigenous language, that is allowed. You can ask an interpreter so that you can speak your language. We've had other witnesses appear at INAN that spoke their Indigenous languages and have it interpreted into English. So that is available to you. I just wanted to ask very quickly to all the witnesses, will it be against reconciliation if the consultations are the cause of delays? I think that we've saw the great work of the Senate make improvements to the previous iteration of this bill, and I wonder if you can share what this will mean to delay using consultation, as I appreciated MP Billy Morin calling it using consultation as a shield.
Shimigwich Ikwe, thank you so very much for the question. Look, absolutely, this goes against reconciliation, and I think that it's time that we give the tools to First Nations people to once and for all decide for themselves who our members are. And I know that there's that big balloon question of, well, what about people that aren't accepted? Well, it's time that we begin to develop our own membership codes. Every single day there's a baby born, and of course we know we're up against a child welfare system that has children being born without support to those parents with that child to register them. There's so many different ways of looking at this, right? But it is discriminatory. It's harmful towards First Nations families, and it's disheartening. It creates division in our country. And like I said, no other group, a Canadian group, and we come from all walks of life, nobody else is numbered. I'm numbered 272-01787. on top of my social insurance number. Billy, what's your number, right? Chief, what's your number? We're all numbered differently. No other group in Canada is numbered the way that First Nations people are numbered. And Canadians, when I tell them this story, and I, the group of First Nations people, I said, "What's your number? What's your number? What's your number?" And we name off our numbers on top of our social insurance number, not including that. People are horrified. I mean, this happened to other groups of people around the world, and we see that was cultural genocide. So we've got to get through this together, my friends, and we've got to work through it. And first and foremost, allow First Nations people to develop our own membership codes, our own membership laws, give them the tools to do it. We never created this. This was done to us by Parliament on the creation of the Indian Act. So, we've got a lot of work to do, but we can do that together and get there in a united way. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our first round. And thank you to all of our witnesses for such insightful and impactful testimony. Chief Miigwech, and thank you very much. We'll suspend while we get our next panel here. Panel. And we have, as an individual, Dr. Pamela Palmater, Chair, Indigenous Governance, Department of Politics and Public Administration, Toronto Metropolitan University. Welcome. And from the Assembly of First Nation National Youth Council, we have Isaiah Bernard, Co-Chair, Councillor, Boladek First Nation. And we have Kyra Labobi. Say the last name for me, please.
Kiera Labob.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Yes, I was. Someone spelled it out hyphenatically for me, so it's just a little off. I apologize. But welcome. We're really looking forward to all of your testimony, including our youth voices here today. So, Chi McWitch. And so we'll start with the doctor online first, please, by video conference.
Thank you so much. Kwe, hello, bonjour, Ninda Louise Pam Palmater. I'm a citizen of the Mi'kmaq Nation, a registered Indian under the Indian Act, and a registered member of my First Nation, Eel River Bar First Nation. And by way of background, I worked for 10 years at Justice Canada, have training in legislative drafting, and also worked at Indian Affairs as it then was. Thank you for inviting me to appear. I never take it for granted. I always appreciate these opportunities. And I want to say right from the start that with the greatest of respect, we could be having this conversation in a study of Bill S2 as it was amended by the Senate. These issues, especially those related to Indian status, band membership, citizenship, we've covered those in significant detail in the Senate and in every previous iteration of Indian Act amendments related to registration. But particularly with S2, there was a historic level of consensus. Was there 100% agreement? No, but pretty close. And consensus doesn't require everyone agree. But we had a historic level of consensus on with First Nations women, First Nations organizations, youth, and First Nation communities on get rid of the second generation cutoff, which is sex and race-based discrimination, and implement a one-parent rule because it deals with all of the complexities in Indian registration, as well as things like unstated paternity. The historic vote, unanimous vote in the Senate, should be a strong indicator of how we need to move forward. They listened to our voices. No one in the Senate said, hey, we're going to make a whole bunch of amendments to the Indian Act because we just feel like doing it. They took our amendments, many of which we drafted. And so the fact that there's a historic consensus and they finally listened to our voices and said, we're going to do what you tell us to do. So why the resistance by ISK? Well, what's going on here? They've resisted this entire time with every amendment. Well, we know why, because the government's position hasn't really changed. They're talking about the absorption of the Indian race into the general population. That's their objective. To continue until there's not a single Indian left in Canada, and that the legal definition of Indian, which they hold on to with a vice grip, this disappearing Indian formula with second gen, results in our gradual assimilation. We've been here before. We've had consultations in 1982. We've had consultations in 1990, 1996, 2011, 2019, and on and on and on. We've talked about this to death, and we keep saying the same thing. Second generation isn't for us. And we have to remember, Indian status is separate from band membership, and it's separate from self-government citizenship. There's all very different issues at play here, but the federal government, under the Indian Act, it's federal legislation, and if it's going to be committed to the rule of law in Canada's own constitution, it has no freedom, no deference, no ability, no option to not remove the sex and race discrimination in Indian registration. There have been no less than 10 Supreme Court of Canada cases that said you can't use consultation as a delay, you can't use financial costs by the federal government. None of these excuses are at play. And they also say you cannot use an incremental approach to get rid of Section 15 discrimination. And that's exactly what this is. And so why are they doing it? Well, it's unjust enrichment on Canada's part, because the longer they delay making these amendments, the less money they have to spend on people who should rightfully be included, and then they insulate themselves from liability with non-liability clauses. And that's wrong. The other thing I think that's really important to remember is that millions of people aren't going to be added. In fact, the estimates are 7,500 people a year divided over 630 First Nations. And we all know that with every single amendment, millions were never added. 130,000 for C31, 38,000 for C3, and S3 is 88,000 so far, divided among 630 First Nations. So the alarmist attitude and fear-mongering that the feds do with First Nations, it doesn't bear truth. And my last point is that the Parliamentary Budget Officer with Bill S3 confirmed that even with the addition of new members, there's not going to be an increase financial burden on First Nations because they almost all live off reserve. The increase in costs, if any, will be to the federal government.
And next we'll go to Isaiah for 5 minutes, please.
Well, I want to begin, committee members, Deluise and Isaiah Bernard, Delia Buluk, and Luegedi. I want to begin by acknowledging that what we are discussing today is not simply legislative reform. It is about identity, it is about belonging, and it is about the future of our nations. Reform of the Indian Act, especially regarding registration and membership, must be First Nations led. For generations, decisions about who we are, who belongs to our communities, have been through a federal legislation that does not reflect our laws, our kinship, justice systems, or our values. The authority to determine our own citizenship is an inherent right, and it is not to be delegated by Canada. It is a core expression of our sovereignty. Any consultation process on reform must be meaningful, not procedural, not just a checkbox. It must be recognized as a critical step toward restoring jurisdiction and advancing self-determination. This requires co-developed framework created in full partnership with First Nations. It must include transparent timelines, clear objectives, and adequate resources to ensure meaningful participations. Without proper funding and sufficient time, consultation risk becomes symbolic rather than transformative. When a First Nation government engages in this process, its long-term social, cultural, and economic vision must be respected. Reform should not enable nations to define their own future, or not to impose another uniform solution. It is also essential that that urban members and marginalized groups within our communities are also included in these discussions. Reform must consider all impacts, especially on those who have historically been excluded or harmed by the Indian Act. I want to share with you guys a personal story about why this means so much for me. A couple years ago, I was at my father's house celebrating Christmas dinner with my family. My brother pulled me aside, and he took a few minutes to dance around the question and what he really wanted to discuss. And finally, he just outright asked me if I would consider signing his son's birth certificate. In that moment, it hit me. I was raised as a 6'1" status Indian. I never had to think about the barriers attached to a 6'2" status. I never had to think what it meant for my children or my grandchildren. But my nephew, my brother's son, is affected by those rules. I have never seen him as anything other than a Mi'kmaq. I know he will grow up learning our language. I know he will grow up learning our culture. He belongs to us. Yet, under the current framework created by Bill C-31 and the second generation cutoff, his identity will never be fully recognized by law. On paper, the system will diminish what we know to be true. No family should have to navigate those kinds of conversations at Christmas. No uncle should have to be asked to find a workaround to the federal legislation in order to protect his nephew's identity. That is the human impact of the second generation cutoff. First Nations have been clear. Distinctions between 6'1" and 6'2" that result in our children and grandchildren losing status have caused real harm. The second generation cutoff fractures families and limits the growth of our nations. It directly infringes on the inherent right to determine our own citizenships. For nearly 150 years, the Indian Act has restricted and undermined that right. It has never reflected our governance system. It has never reflected our kinship. It has never reflected our values. While the Senate's amendments to repeal the second generation cutoff was truly historic, we must be careful not to replace one imposed framework with another. One parent rule may not reflect the traditions and aspirations of every community. A single federally imposed solution risks repeating the issues we're having today and that we're meant to correct. Before any amendments are made, Canada must fulfill its duty to properly engage with First Nations. Any changes to registration and membership must be First Nations-led, grounded, and respect inherent rights and jurisdiction. We must also clearly speak about funding. If membership increases, and it likely will, funding will need to be increased as well. There must be co-developed funding escalators that reflect the real cost of population growth and service delivery. First Nations require sustained and predictable funding, not short-term allocations, but long-term commitments to allow First Nations to plan, govern, and support their citizenship. Increased membership will also mean increased admin responsibilities. Community-based admins will face greater workloads and must be adequately compensated. Our children our children and grandchildren deserve this. They deserve to be acknowledged who they are, not debated. Walalio, MSIP.
You guys have Kyra for 5 minutes, please.
Well, before I speak about legislation, I want to speak about a little girl. My daughter, she is 5 years old, and she knows her Mi'kmaq language. She attends cultural events. She knows the songs. She knows the teachings, and she knows who she is. When you ask her, she proudly says, "I am Mi'kmaq." But on paper, according to Canada, she is not. Not because of anything our people did, not because of our Mi'kmaq laws, not because of our Mi'kmaq culture, because of the Indian Act, and that's why I'm here today. Good morning, committee members. Bill S-2 does not address the need for transformative change in the full recognition of First Nations authority over status. First Nations have voiced that there was inadequate consultation on the proposed amendments to the Indian Act through Bill S-2. Currently, only women who were reinstated after being enfranchised for marrying non-status men can transmit status to their direct descendants to the same extent as those who were never enfranchised. This must be changed if legislative assimilation is to be addressed, because right now, Canada is still deciding who belongs to our nations, not us, and the impact of that decision is not theoretical. It shows up at kitchen tables when parents have to explain to their children why their siblings are status and they are not. It shows up when families fill out forms and realize the government has divided their bloodline into categories. It shows up when children begin to wonder if they are less Indigenous than their cousins. There has not been movement or ambition from Canada to further this work despite commitments from the UNDA Action Plan and the ministers of ISK and CERNA. My grandparents were forced into residential schools, my father sent to Indian day school. Government policies stripped them of their language and culture, and now, generations later, government policy is once again determining belonging by excluding my daughter from recognition of her status. Decades of inaction have resulted in harm that persists across generations. Canada's failure to address these issues contravenes commitments to First Nation peoples and to gender equality. Full reparative measures and policy reforms are essential to repair past harms and prevent future discrimination under the Indian Act. The Indian Act and Canadian policies perpetuate sexist and paternalistic values that continue violence against Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender-diverse First Nations people. Section 6.1 and 6.2 registration categories define family structure according to Eurocentric and heteronormative ideals, and these are not our ways. Before the Indian Act, our nations did not measure belonging through patriarchal formulas. Two-Spirit people were respected. Women were leaders. Kinship was not questioned. The Indian Act did not just change our governance, it changed how we were forced to see our own families. Amendments to date have not gone far enough to eliminate sex-based inequities. Sex-based discrimination continues through second-generation cutoff. Parents do not have equal rights to pass on their status to their children, and the quiet violence of that is devastating, because it forces mothers and fathers to sit with the reality that the government has more authority over the child's identity than they do. This is not our law. This is Canada's law, still shaping our families today. First Nations must reclaim our authority to define our own people, separate from colonial systems, because for us, belonging is about kinship, community ties, cultural continuity, not outdated federal rules. The concept of status Indian didn't exist when our treaties were signed, yet today, treaty beneficiaries are determined by Indian Act status and formulas. The second-generation cutoff is driving widespread disenfranchisement and a steady erosion of our population on paper. Our nations are expanding in spirit, culture, and community, but shrinking in the registry, and the harshness of it unfolds quietly. To you, it looks like declining numbers in reports, it looks like funding formulas, but to us, in reality, it looks like children being told they do not belong to their own people. Funding for essential First Nation services is based on the Indian Act status numbers, so when Canada erases our people on paper, it erases their access to housing, health, and education and practice. Without the Indian Act, First Nations could determine who belongs and support our people directly, ensuring no one is left behind. Criteria could be based on culture, kinship, and our traditional laws, and we must assert our own jurisdiction and move beyond the Indian Act. We are self-determining nations with the authority to decide who our people are. So when my daughter says she is Mi'kmaq, I believe her. My community believes her. Our ancestors would believe her. So why doesn't Canada? And that is what needs to change. Willaluk.
Going to go now to the 6-minute round, and first off we have MP Morin for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the testimony from our guests today. I'm going to go to our youth leadership first. Thank you for being vulnerable with both your stories. Again, very personal touch there. When I left being chief a number of years ago, one of the stats that alarmed me is, and I have it right up here, reported even just as soon as last year, First Nations life expectancy is 19 years lower than other Albertans. That one was kind of hit me in the face. Listening to you guys, yesterday we heard, there could be bans erased as soon as 2066, which is basically your lifetime. You're this next generation of First Nations leadership. What does it feel like in your lifetime to possibly see people get erased?
Thank you, Chief. So that hits hard because growing up, like I said, I never thought of these issues. My brother is a 6'2", I'm a 6'1". I didn't think it would hit so close until he asked me that question. And this is what needs to be changed. When Bill C-31 was entered without consultation, it created so much barriers, and this is something we've been trying to fix for over going on 40 years now. And this has to be fixed right now, and we need the community buy-in as well. What works for the Mi'kmaq might not work for the Mohawks, might not work for the Crees. So we need to have our own. Let the nations decide if possible.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a scary thing. I'm a 6'1", or a 6'2" myself. My dad's a 6'1", and my daughter is considered 6'3". So I think the way that we're moving today and the possible assimilation of our First Nations is greatly impacted because the children are the future. We are the next generations. Yes, we are as well. We're the next leaders, but so are our children. They're the leaders after us. And if they're not considered Indigenous in the eyes of the government, that we're not going to have leaders for the future. So I think that is what really needs to change.
Thank you. I want to go to Dr. Palmater next. You cited some of the numbers. We heard it from Council LaFond in the previous round of testimony. And, you know, as a fiscal conservative, me too, I had to, you know, take a step back and look at the numbers. But, you know, you look at the implementation of things. You come from the parliamentary budget officer, the stats can. You're looking at about 7,500, maybe thereabouts, on average over the next 30 to 40 years. Basic costs would be your basic or NHIB costs. Most of those people live in urban reserves. You're looking at costs of approximately, we heard numbers as close as 50 million first year to 50 million full implementation on the first year on a $25 billion budget of ISC, quite frankly. That seems pretty minuscule. But another thing we just found out in correlation of this today is that the Parliamentary Budget Officer released a report early this morning forecasting that Canada will spend $1 billion a year on the interim federal health program for roughly 600,000 asylum seekers and refugees before provincial health insurance kicks in. How do you feel about the fears that up to 300,000 First Nations people affected by second-generation cutoff are gaining status eligibility will be too expensive, but they spend on these types of costs?
These are really important questions because the fear-mongering historically and even now by people at Indian Affairs, Aboriginal Affairs, ISK over the years has always been around floodgates. You're going to be overwhelmed with new members. Somehow they're all just going to race to the reserve. I don't know where they're going to live. And it's going to just bankrupt bands. There's going to be so much money. But they weren't being truthful because they knew that wasn't the case. The vast majority, we know, are just going to live off reserve. And the cost to Indian Affairs, if they use these services. So that's the thing. They are looking at maximum. They're not looking at the number of people that work in urban areas that are working and they have private health benefits and all of these other things, or they're well beyond the education age. So they always overinflate the numbers. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that those are the numbers. The number of First Nations that would be added every year, this 7,500 number, pales in comparison to the number of new Canadian citizens that are born, because Canadians have a birthright, and people who become Canadian citizens. You know, well over 1 million people. So we're upset about 7,500 people compared to well over 1 million people and the money that's spent on that. And you are right to point out, fraction of what's spent in the total overall budget. And this isn't impacting First Nations, by the way. This is the federal government. So no massive increase in spending. And even if there was a tiny increase in spending, for every dollar we invest in First Nations children, because this is who we're talking about, kids and grandkids. My grandkids are excluded. We save $7 down the line on social programs. So why wouldn't we invest these minuscule amounts into our kids and grandkids who have been cut off by the second generation cutoff? It's just doesn't make even financial sense.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next, we have Jaime for 6 minutes, please.
Yeah, I just want to start off, Walalio, to the youth and to Pam. I didn't stack this as a Mi'kmaq thing, but it ended up that way. I just want to say this is the first time, to my knowledge, that the Assembly of First Nations National Youth Council has ever gotten an opportunity to be witnesses in a parliamentary study, and I just have to say to both of you, you did an amazing job. Made us very proud. As a former AFN National Youth Council member, you guys spoke with heart and really showed us the human level of what this means. Isaiah, I want to start with you. I know that you're a counselor in your community as well. There are community members that are born without status. How does the community of Budladek handle when kids are born without status but they're still on the community? Does your community continue to support them? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So our community, we recognize the second generation cutoff rule is bogus. And we as Budladek and Mi'kmaq decide we accept these ones as our Mi'kmaq members, even though we don't get the funding for them. But it is not only it is the right thing to do to help out our people, because like it's this is just not about the Indian Act. It's about whether like one child and thousands like can be recognized for who they truly are, and we need to like fix this issue now before it becomes a broader, bigger issue then.
So your community uses its own source revenue to make up for the fact that the federal government doesn't provide that because they don't recognize that child. Thank you for putting that on the record. Kiara, you talked a little about the federal government's imposed solutions. Does that mean, do you think that First Nations communities themselves should be the guiding factor on who is and who isn't part of their community, as opposed to Parliament legislation telling them who is and who isn't?
I absolutely think that it should be up to the First Nations to decide who their people are, because they are the ones that see them every day. They're the ones that know them. It all comes back to belonging and who belongs within the community. You don't want, if I was to, let's say, if I was to tell you that your child isn't considered a part of your culture, and you had to sit down and tell them at the dinner table, hey, actually, you're not the same as me. You're not as equal. You're less than. That would have a huge impact on that child. And we see that on a day-to-day basis, not just with my own daughter, with my nephews, with the families that I communicate with through on a day-to-day basis. We work on a beneficiaries process in PEI. I lead that process right now called Ninak Nogama, and that goes beyond the Indian Act and including our families on who is Mi'kmaq, who belongs. When we talk about the heirs of the peace and friendship treaties, who is that? We talk about it on a day-to-day basis, and we hear from families and how they're impacted greatly by the second generation cutoff. So I absolutely do think that it should be up to the First Nations to decide that, because it's their people.
Thank you, Kiara. Dr. Palmater, thank you for joining us. I know we worked together on this for more than 20 years. You've written the book in Canada that kind of demonstrates the urgency of this. In your book, you talk about many communities within the next 20 years not having any status children born into their communities. Can you talk a little bit about the urgency that some communities are facing if we don't address this immediately?
Well, therein lies the financial burden or hardship on First Nations when they have a growing population. We know there's some First Nations that are 40%, 50, 60% 6'2" Indians. All of their kids and grandkids are excluded. So who pays for that? We know the feds aren't going to pay for that. They try to pay for as little as possible. It's why we have all of these court cases on kids in foster care and Jordan's principle. So we've got all of these excluded kids. Who has to pay? A chief and council are accountable to their members. They feel like they have no choice. And there's a lot of First Nations, a lot, who don't have own source revenue, and certainly not enough to pay for everything on reserve. I remember there was a time I was living on reserve back when I didn't have status. I couldn't ride the reserve school bus to school. I mean, it's literally gets down to that. So you're having a system of division that's created and maintained and fostered in First Nations, and it's absolutely unacceptable. There is no law in Canada that allows federal legislation to do this. Federal government can't do it, First Nations can't do it, and that's why you see so many First Nations saying, change this now.
Now, you spoke about the one-parent rule that's coming forward, and I can be in support of that. My concern is that First Nations community might see this as a unilateral process imposed on them. Do you think that whatever the government decides to do on terms of in replacing second-generation cutoff, that community should have the right to opt in or opt out?
First Nations right now have the right under the Indian Act to decide their own membership, who belongs to the communities. That's been there since 1985. The majority of First Nations have chosen not to enact membership codes, in part because they want the feds to clean up their mess, deal with Indian status, all the discrimination, so that they don't assume the liability. And so there's lots of Section 10 bands that have membership codes. The majority go with a one-parent rule. And so we already have a situation where there's status Indians who are not members. We have members who are not status Indians. So that was a decision made in 1985. Changing Indian status, which is an individual direct relationship with the federal government under Section 9124 jurisdiction, is separate from the conversation on membership in First Nations. And so the federal government doesn't have an option. It has to get rid of this second generation cutoff, have a one-parent rule, because Section 15 applies to federal legislation. They don't have an option under the law to do this.
Thank you very much. And next we have Deputy Gill for 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le
Thank you very much, Chair. We have heard strong terms being used, cultural genocide, for instance, identity, colonialism. So we still have progress to make, and we need something more comprehensive than S2, and S2 on its own will not fix everything. So I really do believe that there is urgency to deal with this situation, and the work is probably being done in parallel and simultaneous efforts going on at the same time. So we cannot just sit idly along and do nothing. So I'd like to hear more from you on this particular point, especially the younger generation, Mr. Chair, because they are the ones who are living with the consequences of all this, their parents as well, but maybe more themselves. So I wouldn't want anyone else to decide what I am, so that shouldn't be happening for your children either. And they shouldn't be prevented from having their own identity and culture and their languages as well. And there is the whole question of resources in all this. So I'd like to hear what you think about the urgency of all this, so that the committee takes this into account, work on S2, but at the same time, the House of Commons in its entirety will need to take note of the need to act quickly, given the long number of years that have passed since Confederation with cultural genocide and other sorts of harmful policies. So Ms. Palmater and Mr. Bernard and Ms. Labobi, if the question is for all of you, whoever wants to go first.
You can go ahead of me.
Well, so I was there on during the Senate talks when we're talking about Bill S2, when it passed by unanimous and historic consent. I witnessed a 6'2" woman crying in tears. So yes, Bill S2 is not like the one shoe fits all, but it's a step in the right direction. It's a step to fixing the decades of government telling us who we are, who we're not. At the end of the day, when we're all gone, I know my kids and my grandkids, if they're 6'2s or 6'3s, they will their headstone will say Mi'kmaq person, and the Bill S2 is a step in the right direction, and we need to but yes, we need to find a way to the ones to let the nations decide. I don't know if that answers your question.
C'est vous qui décidez de la réponse.
Well, it's up to you. You decide if it's an answer.
I think for me, from a personal note, growing up as a 6'2" and being around friends who were all 6'1s, you kind of get that specifically the second generation cutoff is discriminatory. And then you see that from your own peers of, well, you're less than me because you're only a 6'2". There's no difference, though. Me and Isaiah, we're the same. We're equal. I don't see him any different. I'd hope he doesn't see me any different. But, that's a reality. That's what I have to face. I'm not friends with these people anymore. I hold nothing bad against them, but I shouldn't be viewed as less than by some people that I personally love. Same with my daughter. Her being cut off, and, she's only 5, but she's going to get to that age where she's going to wonder. And it's a struggle for me, too. She doesn't get the same benefits or the same resources as I do. So then I have to pay in, which I don't mind, but at the same time, she's just as Indigenous as I am.
Okay, so here's what I see that the current issue is. We know that this is part of Canada's overall laws, policies, and practices that have been found to be historic and ongoing genocide. The National Inquiry into Murder of Missing Indigenous Women and Girls that the federal government doesn't even mention anymore specifically said you need to get rid of this discrimination. So did the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. So did the Aboriginal Justice Manitoba Inquiry. So there's resistance. But here's the thing. The feds are saying you either pass S2 as amended, and we just don't deal with these other issues, or you do this never-ending consultation process, which has been going on now for 4 or 5 decades. So, but you can have both. S2 as amended eliminates the federal discrimination in terms of sex and race for Indian status for the vast majority of cases. You can at the same time continue the consultations on, okay, what do we need to do to support you on band membership? Do you want to enter self-government negotiations to talk about citizenship so that we can do a transition? How about funding, housing, infrastructure? How can we support you? How can we support the newly entitled? How do we support them and give them information? So consultation, yes, important on where we're moving to the future. And that's going to be, First Nations will decide for themselves whether they take up band membership codes or whether they have citizenship codes. That they already have that ability. But when it comes to Indian status, there are no options. The Supreme Court of Canada has said over and over and over again, you cannot delay the removal of discrimination, especially since it's known. Canada created this in 1985. It's done no less than 6 consultations. It knows second gen effectively results in our legislative extinction. They do not have authority in the law to guarantee any formula that results in our extinction. And the only way forward that ensures we're not legislatively extinct as Indians is getting rid of second gen and entering a one-parent rule.
Thank you very much.
Membership, citizenship separate.
Thank you very much. MP Schmill for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses, including our youth members, amazing speakers, and hopefully one day I can speak as well as you in Parliament, and you know, one day. Well, I'm a long way off, says the red team, but you know, I thought we were in a collaboration environment here, but that's okay. Doctor, maybe I'll quickly start with you first. I found your comments very interesting when you mentioned how the government wants different paths, where the government can probably deal with this through legislation instead of more consultations. But it seems that not just political parties, because this has been going on for decades or hundreds of years, if you want to even include that. It's just that I find the lack of maybe desire or motivation on behalf of the departments themselves. Now, I know there's lots of hardworking people in the departments, but it just seems that when we had the parliamentary budget officer, I believe it was here a couple parliaments ago, they said the departments are very good at doing things over and over again. So the same thing over and over. They get in a routine. But you create something new and it throws them right in a tizzy. Now, again, we have lots of good, hardworking people, but it kind of matches. That's what came to my mind when you said those words. The department can move if they want. Same thing with the Modern Treaty Commissioner, C10, that we're dealing with. The department can live up to the word of its treaty obligations, either modern or otherwise, but they just don't seem to want to. And I just making these links. I don't know if you have a comment to that.
That's literally the theme here. I have been working on this since I was a child. I have 8 sisters and 4 brothers, most of whom have been working on this issue. I dedicated my doctorate in law on this issue, and I show up at every House committee, every Senate committee, every consultation, all of it. We keep talking about the exact same things. I don't even have to write new submissions anymore. It's just cut, paste, cut, paste, cut, paste. So the issue really comes down to they refuse to give up on this idea that Indians under the Indian Act are going to exist forever, which is what the treaties envisioned. They had hoped that when they separated Indian status and band membership, that the bands would just make sure that there's no members. But the majority of these membership codes deal with, of all the different types, one parent rule. Nobody wants to be extinct in the future. Only Canada does. And we know why. There's two reasons. One is that it removes us. If we don't exist politically, legally, then we don't get to have a Section 35 rights. We don't get to resist what's happening on our territories. We don't have a say in what's going on in Canada. And the other thing is always comes down to money. For every day that they delay this, for every decade, they're saving money. And every time they've made an amendment, they insulate themselves from liability and says, oh, you First Nation women and kids, you don't get to sue us. We're making billions of dollars in settlements on residential schools, 60 Scoop, Inuit sled dogs, First Nation, like you name it across the board. But we refuse to compensate First Nation women and kids, and we refuse to allow us and our descendants to exist in the future. That's what it is. They can say anything they want to, but it's an easy solution. Do S2 as amended. We've already gone through this process, and do your consultations on membership and citizenship and whether there's going to be a transition in the future and contribution agreements and funding. They could do it if they want to. Yet they're hiding behind consultation, and we have a legal duty to consult. How many times did we hear the minister say that? And it's like, well, wait a second. Wasn't it the federal government that went to the Mikisew Cree Nation, fought them all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada to prove they don't have a legal duty to consult on legislation? I think that's wrongly decided, but they use it for the majority of legislation like C5. And now here we are. No, despite the fact that we have the majority of First Nations saying, let's do C2 and consultations. Here's all of the amendment. Oh, no, we're not going to listen to your voices. That's literally the opposite of consultation. So why would they do that? Delay funding and to try to manufacture dissent through fear-mongering. And I'm saying that with respect because I worked at Indian Affairs, I worked at Justice Canada, and I've been a part of every single one of these processes. And I hear officials time and time again, oh, you're going to go bankrupt, it's going to be overrun, you're going to be flooded. Sure, certainly you don't one size fits all. Well, actually, equality, charter equality is one size fits all.
Thank you very much.
Non-discrimination is one size fits all.
Thank you very much. And next, Deputy Levac for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much to all of our witnesses today for coming and testifying. Happy to have you. Dr. Palmater, I'd like to get your thoughts on, from a governance perspective, what the key legal and the constitutional considerations are, or that Parliament has to weigh when we're addressing second generation cutoff.
I think the most important thing is that all of the Supreme Court of Canada cases that have said you cannot have federal legislation that discriminates, that violates Section 15, equality and non-discrimination on the basis of race and sex, especially when they know. So they've been able to immunize themselves saying, oh, well, we didn't know there was discrimination. Now they know, so they're not going to be able to hide behind non-immunity. We know from all of these cases, Schachter, Eldridge, Singh, Bolak, Corbière, you cannot use administrative difficulty, finances, delay. You can't even use consultation to delay ending discrimination. And so we know from many other cases, Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, that the federal government continues to use consultation, despite when they know what the solution is, to avoid charter equality. And that's the problem. Band membership, if it's a matter of band membership, there's already a process under the Indian Act. Bands can enact their own membership if they want to. So this isn't we're telling them who has to be a member. No, we're talking about the Section 9124 jurisdiction over Indians and lands reserved for Indians, that one direct relationship between individual Indians and the feds, and they can't get rid of us. They just can't maintain this extinction formula anymore.
Thank you. I forgot to mention, Mr. Chair, that I'll be sharing my time with MP Saint-Pierre.
Great. Mrs. Dr. Paul Matter, I'm going to pose my questions to the youth, but I just want to thank you for joining us today and joining Senate and every time you're in committees. I'm a huge fan of your work, and we met probably 15 years ago. I was representing Listagouche for a land claims agreement. So we met ages ago before I was in politics and while I was a lawyer. So thanks for coming today. Mrs. Labob, thanks for joining us today. And your testimony around your 5-year-old daughter touched me particularly because I have a 6-year-old daughter. And the last 24 hours has been particularly hard for me. So I want to hear you a little bit more about what this means for you on a personal level. Raising a 5-year-old daughter and just speaking from a personal perspective, if you don't mind.
Yeah, this would mean a lot. For me personally, yes. For other families too. That also hits personally for me as well. Like I feel the impact from my own community and how you walk into a room of children and, majority of them aren't considered Indigenous, my daughter included. And it is really heartbreaking that that's the reality that we live in and that she doesn't get to, go harvest sweetgrass with her grandparents because she doesn't have the right like I would. I could go and do it freely and I can't bring her with me. I can teach her, but she doesn't have the Aboriginal and treaty rights that I hold. And I think that's why we need to fix this because every day children are being impacted by this specifically and it's going to impact their children and it shouldn't, especially when, her grandfather is full status, his parents full status, I'm half, and then she's just cut off. How does that go from a full status half to she has nothing? And that is what really sucks.
Thank you. And yes, it's a tough time. Thank you. Next, we have Deputy Gill for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Palmater, for your remarks. You were saying that you no longer need new text, you cut and paste, and on this side of things, I think that there shouldn't be any excuses anymore to keep delaying things. So if you have any comments, because we talk about consultations and that how complex it is, but at the same time some progress can be made. But on the other hand, you have the whole question of resources, and often that's a pretext that gets overused. And it takes investment, of course, but there are moral and legal obligations involved, of course. So if you want true reconciliation, you have to take that step. So if you were to boil everything down, all these years down, what would you tell us that parliamentarians should know? Because we're in a particular situation, we're in a special situation, we will have to make some decisions based on your recommendations. So what would your take-home message be, if you will, a summary of your time here, Mrs. Palmater? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. The way forward is to pass S2 as amended in the Senate, because those amendments represent what First Nations told them to do. I mean, if ever there was consultation, that's where it is. At the same time, they can continue on with consultations on band membership, citizenship, funding, technical supports, all of these things. So it's not either or. You can do both at the same time and also support people. And to remember that, they also need to stop saying, well, we have this court-imposed deadline, because the court actually referred to the Deschanel case and the multiple extensions that the federal government got to make bigger, larger amendments than what was in the court case, and they were directed to do so. And they said, okay, I will remain over this case, and we can have an extension if you need it. And we need it. We will only need it if they put consultations, an endless amount of consultations, because the minister said for as long as First Nations need. So that could be 10 years. If you put consultation before Canada, the heart of Canadian law, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and equality for everyone. We are the only ones that have to fight for sex equality and racial equality, the only ones. And the fact that we're still having this conversation is bizarre, but go forward. S2 is amended, do the consultations at the same time on all of the other issues and funding. We can do both at the same time, and really, we're legally required to do so. This isn't an option, even though the feds treat it like an option. There's something called the rule of law.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, well, thank you very much to, again, some just terrific testimony. And it was great to hear you, Doctor, and to the youth. You speak like elders, very much so, and thank you very much for sharing that with us. Before we leave, just I want to take a few seconds. Yes? Oh, so go ahead, Isaiah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to point out something. I heard one MP say on the other team, we should all be one team. This is a unilateral issue, because we're the only people who are forced to love who we want. We should be able to love. I should be able to love who I want to love. I should be able to pass down my status. On reserve land, we can't own anything, but I should be able to pass down the one thing I do own, and that's my status. Walalio.
Chimigwich. So, Jaime, okay.
Yeah, one of the witnesses alluded to a parliamentary budget officer report on how much this cost, that it was in the Senate. Can we see that at some point? I don't know if but I'd love to see the numbers on what they came up with.
Sure, the analysts can get their hands on that, I'm positive. Thank you very much for pointing that out. Okay, and just very quick before I put the gavel down, we had a discussion earlier about the 25th session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which this committee has traveled to before. There is a pared down budget that I shared with the vice chairs, just to let you know. So I would ask for approval of this budget, and if this budget is approved, then I would go to the liaison committee, and then the liaison committee would decide whether or not we get funded for this. So I'm going to read this. Go ahead, Deputy Gill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, you said there was a discussion today. That's what I heard in interpretation. The discussion hasn't happened yet, right?
Previous one.
Ouais, exact. Okay, parfait.
Previous, and we took everything
Merci.
that you guys said
Merci.
and brought back this budget. So I'm going to read it to you because everything else has been circulated before we've read it. I'll just do this real quick, and then we'll just wham and we're gone. So so there's been discussions concerning the proposed budget in the amount of $85,305.56 for 5 members of the committee, plus appropriate staff interpretation, the analysts and the clerk, to travel to attend the first week of the 25th session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Is there a motion that the budget be adopted? Someone move. Jaime, and okay. So we're all okay for me to go to the liaison committee with this then? Okay, approved. Approved. I see nodding heads. And now I'm asking for permission to adjourn. I see nodding heads. Thank you very much again. We're doing the first week, yeah. So the opening is the 20th, so you get there Sunday night.